The roar of the engines drowned the world in chaos, and only one sound broke through that mechanical storm: the faint, fragile rhythm of a child's breathing pressed against his father's chest. Brian held his son tightly, as though his arms could become a shield against the inevitable. The boy's small fists clung to his jacket, his wide eyes brimming with fear that he could not yet name. Across from them, Brian's sister stood with a gun in her hand, its cold steel aimed directly at her own brother. She did not tremble. She did not hesitate. Years of bitterness had turned her into stone, loyalty worn thin until it was only a mask, betrayal stitched into her as if it were a second skin. "Jump with your brat," she hissed, her voice sharp as the blade of a knife. "Or I'll put 2 bullets through both your heads." Beside her, Brian's uncle yanked the hatch of the aircraft open with a violent motion. The world held back. A torrent of air rushed in, swallowing voices, tearing at clothes, pulling everything toward the sky's endless void. His uncle leaned in, his face twisted into something almost triumphant, and shouted, "You don't stand a chance of surviving." But his words were shredded, devoured by the storm of the blades overhead. The barrel of the gun pressed harder into Brian's ribs, forcing a choice that was no choice at all. His eyes dropped to the parachute strapped clumsily to his body. He knew it for what it was the moment he saw it: ropes frayed, buckles too weak, gear that belonged in a scrapyard. It wasn't just negligence, it was sabotage, carefully laid out like a trap. It was never meant to save him. It was meant to kill him. Everything had been arranged. Everything had been planned. For a fleeting second, he looked at his son, the boy's innocent eyes staring back at him, his tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his father's coat, as though his grip could anchor them to life itself. And Brian realized something. The decision was no longer his to make. It had been made the moment his son was born. If he had to die, then he would die holding his child, not begging for mercy from those who shared his blood. He closed his arms around his son, pressed his lips against his hair, and stepped into the void. The sky swallowed them whole. Hours later, when the world had turned to silence, Brian stumbled through the forest, his body battered, his son still alive though shaken and wounded. Every step was agony, but every breath his boy took was proof of survival. Behind them, far away in a world of wealth and power, the private jet landed on its familiar strip. His sister and his uncle descended, laughing, their faces painted with cruel certainty. They were convinced the earth had already swallowed Brian, convinced that their problem was solved. But survival is not just instinct. It is memory sharpened into a weapon. As Brian laid his son's head gently onto his lap beneath the canopy of trees, he let the betrayal seep into him, not as weakness but as fuel. His sister's cold eyes when she aimed at him. His uncle's silence, complicit and calculating. Together they had written his death into their script, and they had expected him to play his part. But Brian had always been a different kind of man. He would not die quietly. It had never been about money, not entirely. It was something older, something planted long ago. Memories stirred, fragments of whispers in childhood hallways, his father's will rewritten in secret, fortunes divided with surgical cruelty. Brian had been left with the smallest share, while his sister had been handed the largest. His uncle had been given power over it all, the puppet master behind the strings of their inheritance. But greed never rests. Greed does not stop at division, it seeks elimination. That parachute was never meant to save him. It was a knife, sharpened with betrayal, and it had been waiting for him to step into its trap. But they forgot one thing: Brian was still alive. And in that truth, he found his first weapon. To fake his death was to seize control. It was the silence he needed, the invisibility from which to strike. Days passed. His sister and uncle moved through their world unburdened, celebrating his absence. They believed the forest had swallowed him, but in reality, he was watching, listening, learning. He traced the pulse of their deceit through phone records and financial trails. He found fingerprints on documents, secret meetings under the cover of night. He watched them shift money from one account to another, weaving lies with lawyers who prepared fraudulent papers. He saw them raise glasses in celebration, his uncle smugly declaring, "It's pruning the family tree." His sister smiled as she rehearsed her lies for society dinners, her voice firm, her role perfected. Brian said nothing. Not yet. His son asked him one night, his young voice trembling, "Will they pay for what they did, Dad?" And Brian, his gaze sharp with a truth the boy couldn't yet understand, answered, "Yes. But not with bullets or fire. Because I've learned something deeper. The real punishment is not death, it's exposure. To strip them bare until nothing is left, not even their mask." So he built his weapon, piece by piece. Copies of wire transfers, recordings captured in secrecy, and finally, buried in the dusty archives of an old lawyer, his father's original will, notarized, untouched by their lies. Each fragment was a blade, invisible but lethal. And when the night came, Brian did not storm through their doors. He did not shout. He did not burn their empire with fire. He walked into it. His sister's mansion glimmered under chandeliers, a kingdom of gold, silk, and false laughter. Guests danced and drank, oblivious to the rotting foundation beneath their feet. His uncle sat smugly by the fireplace, glass in hand, certain of his untouchable power. At first, no one noticed the figure standing in the doorway. But when they did, silence swept across the hall like a shadow. Faces turned pale. Conversations died. Laughter curdled into dread. Because the man they believed buried was alive. Brian stood in their midst, a ghost returned not for forgiveness but for justice. He approached his uncle and handed him a heavy folder. "What is this?" the man asked, his voice trembling for the first time in years. "Nothing," Brian replied coolly. But inside that folder was everything. Bank statements, secret recordings, the true will of his father, every proof of their conspiracy and attempted murder. The glass slipped from his uncle's hand, shattering across the marble floor. His face broke apart like clay, disbelief melting into horror. "This isn't possible," he whispered. But Brian cut him down with silence, with facts, with evidence so sharp they bled before they could deny it. Guests began to whisper. Eyes sharpened, alliances shifting. The room turned not toward Brian, but against them. Their empire of lies collapsed without a single match struck. Later, in the study, his sister cornered him. Her voice was sharp but trembling. "You could have killed me." "You already tried," Brian replied, his gaze steady, his words heavy. Her hands shook. Her excuses faltered, collapsing before they even formed. He leaned toward her, his voice colder than the grave. "Death is simple, too merciful. You'll live stripped of everything. No inheritance, no mask. Everyone will know who you are, and you'll carry that weight every single day." And she broke, not with tears, but with silence. His uncle tried to speak, but Brian cut him down with a single sentence. "The next time you look in the mirror, remember, you lost to the brother you thought you buried." He left before their pleas could spill into the air. He didn't need to hear them. Revenge was already complete. Outside, the night was freezing. His son sat waiting in the car, his eyes searching. "Is it over?" the boy asked. "Yes," Brian said. But inside, he knew the truth was sharper. It never ends. Betrayal does not dissolve. It calcifies in memory, turning to stone within the veins. He drove into the darkness, the lights of the mansion flickering briefly in the mirror before vanishing into night. What remained was silence. Not peace. Not forgiveness. Only clarity. They had tried to erase him. Instead, he erased the illusion they had built. And in that silence, Brian understood with brutal finality. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by betrayal. And never again would he let them write his ending. If Brian's story gripped you, the pain of betrayal, the weight of survival, and the cold fire of justice, then stay with us. More tales of vengeance, resilience, and unmasking hidden truths await you here. Subscribe, like, and share if you believe some betrayals are too sharp to forgive.